Hey guys, how you going? This is BillyEatWorld again, and in this video I've got some more Battlefield 5 tips for you guys, but today we're actually going to do something a bit different, and that's because I haven't seen a really good PC controls guide yet on YouTube for Battlefield 5, and it got me thinking because, well, the default control scheme isn't really as optimized as it could be. So what I want to do for you guys today is share with you my setup, but just bear in mind that it is geared towards the base game, so if you play a lot of Firestorm, you might need to tweak it up a bit. But in saying that though, I mean, this is actually a pretty similar scheme to what I use in most FPS games, so whether or not you're brand new to PC or you're a veteran, hopefully you'll get something out of it at the very least. Alright, so to kick off, before we get into specifically what we are going to change, well, number one, you want to reset all your controls to default before we start, and we should talk about what we're not going to change. And obviously the main thing here for most people is going to be your standard movement keys, because obviously W, A, S, and D are default in most FPS games, and you already control them with your strongest fingers. Now, the problem is that in Battlefield 5 and most other arcade-style FPS games, there's actually quite a few controls that require you to take your fingers off one of these movement keys. And so that's the whole idea behind the changes that we're going to make in this video. We want to try and set it up in such a way that we don't have to take our fingers off W, A, S, and D at all. Alright, so with that being said, the two extra fingers that you do have available on your left hand to use for everything else are obviously your pinky and your thumb. And normally in the default scheme, you use your pinky on left shift for sprint, and you use your thumb for jump occasionally on the spacebar. Now, I think this is actually kind of crazy because, well, you want to try and use your stronger fingers on the keys that you use the most, which in this case is your thumb and the sprint key. And so the very first thing that I normally do, and kind of the main thing you absolutely have to do for this setup to work, is swap everything on left shift and spacebar around. So in other words, things like jump, vault, parachute, sprint, and steady scope. Now, the other main reason I have for switching jump and sprint around is because, well, unlike in some other games, there's no option to toggle sprint on and off in Battlefield 5 unless you want to turn on auto sprint. And so what that means is whatever finger you choose to be on sprint is going to be stuck on that key a lot of the time. And if that's your pinky, well, it's going to make it a lot harder to hit some of the really useful keys on the left-hand side, like tab and left control. And the main reason I mention this is because, well, the tab key is used in a lot of other shooter games for the map, which is a lot more useful than the scoreboard, which tab is set to by default in Battlefield games. And so in a nutshell, if you free up your pinky by putting sprint on your spacebar, well, then you'll be free to switch your map to tab, where it'll actually be in a spot that you can use it easily in-game. Not just that, but you'll be also a lot more free to use crouch, which, considering it defaults to the left control key, is kind of hard to use if your pinky is already holding down the shift key to sprint. And considering you can actually crouch sprint now in Battlefield 5, well, that's something you're definitely gonna want to do, unless you want to toggle crouch on, which is by default on the X key. Now, the problem with the X key though, and also Z, which is the default key for prone, is that, going back to the start of the video, it's one of those awkward keys which makes you take your finger off a movement key to use. So I find the best way to avoid this issue is to just swap toggle crouch and prone to left control and alt, and what you'll find is this will make them a lot easier to use with your pinky and thumb instead. Alright, so that's basically going to finish up most of the changes we're going to make to the keyboard, but with that being said, we are going to try and handle a few more keyboard functions over on the mouse instead. And so my first tip here would be, if you're not already using at least a 5-button gaming mouse, then that's something you're definitely going to want to invest in, because it does speed up things quite a bit. Now, as for my mouse setup, well, it's actually pretty standard, but the main thing that I've got changed is that I completely disable the scroll wheel because it's just too easy to accidentally bump by mistake. And so as it's normally bound to switch weapon anyway, what I normally do is just rebind the scroll wheel button to that instead, which is a pretty small change. It doesn't take too much to get used to, and you have no risk of bumping something. Now, the other thing I usually do is I bind my two side mouse buttons to reload and VoIP, which for me just happens to be the two most common things I'm usually hitting in game. But in your case, it might actually be something different. For example, you might want to bind your gadgets to these instead, or maybe even your melee or your grenade keys. In any case though, just make sure you bind the one you use the most, which in my case is reload, to the side button closest to the front of the mouse, because that's where your thumb is normally going to come to rest, and it's obviously going to take a fraction of a second longer to angle your thumb if you need to use the back one instead. Now, just before we finish up, I want to give you guys a few tips on controls for vehicles, because obviously there's room for improvement here as well. And most importantly, I think the most frustrating thing is that in the default scheme, you actually have to use a separate button to go from chase cam to first person, which is effectively like going into ADS for vehicles. So the first thing that I do for all vehicles except the gunner seat, which kind of works like a normal gun anyway, is swap the zoom and chase cam controls around, which should be to C and right mouse button respectively. And not just that, but the other thing that I also do is I actually also bind zoom to right mouse as well. And so the way that works is when you just tap it, it'll go in and out of first person, like for example, soldier ADS. But, and here's the thing, when you hold it down, it'll zoom in after a while as well. Now, as for aircraft controls though, well, you'll pretty much want to do the same thing, but the main difference is that zoom and free look aren't actually tied to the same control like they are when you're in a tank. And not just that, but for some reason, the zoom trick I just mentioned before actually kind of breaks free look in planes. So what I normally do instead is generally set my free look to C like it is in a tank, but I set zoom to left shift. Also, the other thing I do specifically for planes is I bind pitch up and pitch down to keyboard keys, because you'll find you'll turn way faster if you hold in a key than if you use your mouse to turn. And the obvious keys that you'll want to do this with are W and S, which are normally accelerate and brake by default, and so I normally also rebind them to space and left alt instead. But anyway, guys, that's about all of the controls that I change in my scheme. But just before we do finish up, though, there's a few other things that you want to watch out for when you're customizing your controls. And firstly, well, you'll want to remember that some controls, like the map, for example, you have to set separately in every category. So just make sure you double check to make sure you haven't left any out. Also, another thing you want to check for is that you aren't accidentally doubling up on controls, because unlike in a lot of other games, Battlefield 5 does let you have multiple controls bound to the same key. Like for example, when you're setting up some of the other controls we've talked about already in this video, you want to watch out for things like the fire control in tanks and planes, which is actually set to space by default, even though no one actually ever uses that in-game. But apart from that, guys, that just about wraps up this video. So as always, make sure you let me know what you think in the comment section down below. And look, if you think you've got an even more efficient control setup for Battlefield 5, well, leave that down below as well, because I'd love to take a look. As always, though, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and please feel free to check out the links in the description if you want to see any more of these videos. And also, don't forget you can find my Twitter and Discord links down there as well if you want to keep in touch. And as always, until next time, see you later, and have a good one.